What if the woman who saved God's chosen prophet was never honored for it, but nearly forgotten instead? She married the man who spoke to God as a friend, the man who led millions out of slavery, split the sea, and stood on Sinai as the mountain trembled. But before all of that, before the plagues, before the commandments, before the Red Sea opened, God almost struck him down. Not Pharaoh, not Egypt, not the armies of darkness. God. Why? Why would the Most High call Moses? Then try to kill him? The answer lies not in a battlefield, but in a quiet, strange moment by the side of the road. And standing in that moment, holding a bloody knife and a desperate prayer, was his wife. A woman few mention, a woman Scripture barely names. She wasn't Hebrew. She wasn't from Egypt. She wasn't raised in the covenant. Yet she performed the very act that Moses, God's chosen vessel, failed to do. Who was this woman? And why has her story been buried in the shadows? What if her hands carried the weight of a forgotten covenant? What if her obedience bridged the gap between life and judgment? This is not just the story of a marriage. It's not just the tale of a prophet's wife. This is a hidden doorway into divine justice, mercy, and mystery. This is the story of Zipporah, the forgotten wife of Moses. Welcome to the Bible in white and black, where we uncover the hidden truths of Scripture with bold clarity and restore the voices of those history tried to erase. Before we begin, declare this with me. I am a covenant keeper. In the comments, who were the Midianites? When we think of Moses, our minds often rush to Egypt, Pharaoh, and the burning bush. But between the palace and the mountain, between exile and destiny, God placed him among a forgotten people, the Midianites. But their story didn't begin with Moses. It began with Abraham. Yes, that Abraham. In Genesis 25 verse 1 through 2, we read that after Sarah's death, Abraham took another wife named Keturah, and from their union came sons, among them Midian. Midian was not the child of the covenant like Isaac. He was not the promised seed, but he was still a son of Abraham, carrying blood that heaven had once called blessed. The Midianites, then, were neither fully Hebrew nor fully foreign. They were a mixed people, walking between two worlds, the memory of covenant and the wilderness of exile. And it's here, in this strange and sacred space, that Moses finds himself. He flees Egypt, a fugitive, rejected by Pharaoh and distrusted by his own people. He sits at a well in Midian, thirsty, alone, broken. And just like Isaac found Rebekah at the well, just like Jacob found Rachel at the well, Moses meets Zipporah. Not by chance, not by accident, but by divine orchestration. She is the daughter of Jethro, also called Reuel, priest of Midian. A priest. Let that sink in. This woman was not raised in slavery. She was not a victim of Pharaoh's cruelty. She was the daughter of a spiritual leader, shaped by sacred rhythms foreign to Moses, yet ancient in their own right. What did she carry in her spirit? Was it echoes of Abraham's teachings passed down through Midianite generations? Was it reverence? Order? A different but familiar fear of the true God? Or did she carry idols and traditions that looked holy, but were empty inside? Royal priesthood? Foreign gods? Or both? This is the tension Zipporah walked in, the space between two revelations. And it's in that space, between covenant and culture, that she becomes bound to Moses, not just as a wife, but as the one who would later stand in the breach between life and death when even Moses failed to act. Her people were descended from a forgotten branch of Abraham's tree. But God had not forgotten them, and he did not forget her. In Zipporah, we see a woman born of a mixed legacy, but chosen for a divine moment, a moment that would change everything. And it came to pass by the way in the inn, that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Exodus 4 verse 24. Wait, what? God had just appeared to Moses in the burning bush. He had called him by name, given him signs, spoken promises, empowered him to stand before Pharaoh. This was God's chosen deliverer, the man handpicked to free his people after 400 years of bondage. But now, just a few verses later, God comes to kill him. It is one of the most unsettling moments in the entire Bible. There is no warning, no build-up, no angel with a message, just divine fury unleashed in the night. And Moses? Silent, passive. It is Zipporah, his Midianite wife, who takes action. She sees what's happening. She doesn't wait for Moses to rise. She doesn't cry for help. She doesn't run. Instead, she reaches for a knife, grabs her young son, and circumcises him. In blood and urgency, she touches the foreskin to Moses' feet and declares, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." The attack stops. God relents, and Moses lives. Let's pause. What just happened? This moment is wrapped in mystery, but here's what we know. Moses had failed to circumcise his son. And this wasn't a small oversight, it was covenant disobedience. Circumcision was the physical sign of God's eternal promise to Abraham, a sign of obedience, of belonging, of separation unto God. And Moses, the man chosen to lead Israel into covenant destiny, had neglected that sign in his own house. He was about to stand before Pharaoh with divine authority. Yet the covenant in his own family was broken, and God would not overlook it. But here's the divine irony. It wasn't Moses who remembered the covenant. It was Zipporah, the foreign woman. The outsider, the one not raised in Abraham's house, understood the seriousness of the Abrahamic covenant more than the Hebrew prophet himself. She discerned what Moses missed. And in that moment, she didn't just act as a mother or a wife. She acted as a priest. She shed the blood. She performed the sacred rite. She stood between death and destiny, and God honored her. Was Zipporah more spiritually aware than Moses? It's a hard question, but the scriptures make it plain. In that moment, yes. She saw what Moses did not. She acted when Moses would not. And through her obedience, the plan of redemption stayed on course. This wasn't just a woman stepping in. This was a divine appointment, hidden in a marriage. In Zipporah's hands, we find covenant restored, blood remembered, judgment reversed. And yet, after this moment, she disappears from the narrative. No praise, no honor, no songs, but heaven remembers. She saved Moses. She upheld the covenant. She stood between God's wrath and his chosen prophet. And then, silence. After that blood-soaked night at the inn, Zipporah disappears from the story for chapters. No celebration, no mention, no honor. The woman who literally saved the deliverer of Israel vanishes into the background. But why? Why would Scripture highlight her in a moment of divine crisis, only to cast her into obscurity? Why does the Bible give us names, praise, and lineage for so many others, yet silence Zipporah after she steps into priestly authority? Eve is named as the mother of all living. Sarah is celebrated for her faith and named in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews. Miriam, Moses' sister, is remembered as a prophetess and worship leader. But Zipporah? She is silenced. Could it be deliberate? Many scholars and theologians have wrestled with this erasure. Some point to patriarchal editing, an ancient discomfort with women who held power, especially spiritual power. A woman performing a sacred act that a prophet neglected? A foreign wife correcting a chosen Hebrew man? To some scribes, that may have been too much. So the story moves on without her. Other scholars believe it was political tension, the unease of a Hebrew deliverer being married to a Midianite. After all, Israel was being called into a distinct identity, separated from other nations. And yet, Moses, the face of that calling, was joined to a woman outside the covenant line. It was complicated, just as it was with Ruth, the Moabite, Tamar, the Canaanite, Rahab, the Jericho outsider, all of them foreign women, all of them tied to Israel's destiny. All of them, at some point, silenced, erased, or doubted, and still, used mightily by God. Zipporah stands in their company, a woman with foreign blood but divine timing, a woman who stepped into a sacred gap, then was quietly removed from the stage. Perhaps the discomfort wasn't just about her lineage, but about her authority. She didn't wait for her husband to fix it. She didn't ask for permission. She performed the covenant act in a moment when the man of God stood still. And for that, history turned its face. But heaven did not. Her story may be silenced in the scrolls, but her legacy is loud in the spirit. Because when Moses couldn't move, when death was knocking, when the covenant was broken, it was a woman with foreign blood and sacred boldness who remembered God. Zipporah was never meant to be ordinary. She stood at a divine crossroads, between the priesthood of Midian and the prophethood of Moses, between her father's sacred lineage and her husband's divine calling, between a desert homeland and a destiny wrapped in Hebrew promise. She was a woman of two worlds, and in one unforgettable night, both worlds collided. At that mysterious inn, the silence of heaven broke. The wrath of God burned, and Moses, the chosen vessel, was found unprepared. But Zipporah? She was ready. Before the law was ever thundered from Sinai, Zipporah was already keeping it. Before tablets of stone, before commandments carved in fire, there was a woman in a dark inn with blood on her hands and covenant on her heart. We must ask, did Moses learn covenant obedience from Zipporah? Could it be that the man chosen to carry God's law first witnessed it through the hand of a woman, a Midianite woman, a wife, a mother, a priest's daughter, a deliverer in her own right? Zipporah's act was more than practical, it was prophetic. She fulfilled what Moses delayed. She stepped in where death threatened. Think deeper. Could Zipporah be a type of Christ? It seems almost unthinkable. A foreign woman as a shadow of the Messiah? But look closely. She sheds blood to save another. She intercedes in a moment of divine wrath. She bridges the gap between covenant and disobedience. She fulfills the law before the law is written. Zipporah stands in the shadows of the Old Testament, like a whisper of the gospel to come. The bride who bleeds to save the bridegroom. Her bloodied hands echo the pierced hands of another. And her cry, bridegroom of blood, points to the blood covenant that would one day seal the union between Christ and his bride, the church. She is not just Moses' wife. She is a sign, a symbol, a divine interruption, a sacred warning, a redemptive figure hidden in the dust of Midian and the mystery of Sinai. There is a moment, subtle, almost hidden, that reveals a truth too powerful to ignore. And Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married. Numbers 12 verse 1. The Hebrew says it plainly. Because of the Kushite woman, Kushite, Ethiopian, black. Who was this woman? Some say she was another wife Moses took after Zipporah. Others argue she was Zipporah herself, seen through a different cultural lens. But regardless of the debate, one thing is undeniably clear. She was a black woman. Let's dig deeper. Midian and Cush, though not identical, were intertwined in ancient geography and tribal movements. Trade routes, marriage alliances, and migrations blurred their lines. And the ancient world didn't categorize ethnicity the way we do today, but appearance, region, and reputation often told the story. To call someone a Kushite was not about paperwork. It was about skin. It meant dark-skinned, African, descended from the line of Cush, son of Ham. So whether Zipporah was Midianite by tribe and Kushite by blood, or whether she bore that description by appearance, her identity was black. And Miriam noticed. She saw what generations would try to ignore or rewrite, that the woman chosen by Moses and defended by God was not just foreign. She was African. She was different. She was uncomfortable to those who clung to cultural purity. She was powerful in a way that challenged the family structure. So Miriam opened her mouth, and judgment fell. God himself stepped in, not just to protect Moses, but to defend the woman. And what did God do? He struck Miriam with leprosy. White as snow, a skin disease as a response to racial contempt. Symbolic, striking, divine. The only time in Scripture that God afflicts someone with leprosy for speaking against a woman. And what was the root of the offense? Not her character, not her actions, her ethnicity. In that moment, the God of Israel sent a clear message. He stands with the marginalized. He defends the dark-skinned bride. He silences the voice of superiority, even when it comes from his own prophets. And isn't that breathtaking? The very God who called Moses, who anointed Miriam, who placed Aaron as high priest, turned his wrath not on the outsider, but on the insider who judged her. The story of Zipporah, or the Kushite woman, is more than a marriage subplot. It is a confrontation with our biases. It is a revelation of divine justice. We often skip past these verses, but when we pause, we see a black woman standing at the center of God's prophetic plan. We see her attacked and vindicated, dismissed and defended, unknown by name, yet known intimately by God. This chapter in Numbers isn't just about a family argument. It's about God's fierce protection of a woman the world tried to look down on. And it still speaks today. When God chooses, he doesn't choose by skin, status, or story. He chooses by covenant. And in that covenant, Zipporah, the Ethiopian woman, stands tall. She appears only briefly in the pages of Scripture, but in the shadows of ancient writings, Zipporah's name echoes with power. In the Midrash and Jewish commentaries, Zipporah is not forgotten. She is called wise because she understood spiritual truths that even Moses struggled with. She is called protective because when death came for her husband on the road, she acted. She is even called prophetic because she saw what needed to be done and did it before the angel could strike. According to the rabbis, she saved Moses' life, not just with a blade but with boldness, not just with blood but with belief. They say that without Zipporah, there would be no Exodus, no plagues, no Red Sea crossing, no Mount Sinai, because without her, Moses would have never made it. But the story doesn't end with Jewish texts alone. In Ethiopian Orthodox Church traditions, Zipporah is honored deeply. She is seen not merely as a supportive wife, but as a bearer of divine destiny. To them, Zipporah carries the weight of a woman chosen to walk beside a prophet, to preserve a covenant, and to reflect the presence of Africa in the foundations of faith. In their liturgy, she's remembered not as a footnote, but as a pillar. Even among early Christian writers, her figure begins to shimmer with deeper meaning. But Zipporah's legacy is not loud. It's not trumpeted in headlines or stretched across scrolls. It's hidden, woven in symbols, protected in silence. She is the woman who stood in the gap, who acted when no one else did, who loved beyond borders, and whose presence shaped the very course of biblical destiny. How do you measure a legacy like that? Not by chapters written, but by the chapters that would never exist without her. Not by how loudly her name is praised, but by how deeply her actions echo in the halls of eternity. Zipporah may not have delivered laws from Sinai. She may not have held a staff or parted a sea, but she held the man who did. She shielded him with wisdom, and she stood as a bridge between the known and the foreign, between prophecy and survival. In the margins of ancient texts, her memory is honored. In the reverence of African traditions, her story is kept alive. And in the unfolding plan of God, her role was never small. Zipporah was not just a wife, she was a witness, a warrior in silence, a keeper of divine legacy. And her name still speaks. To every woman who stands unrecognized, to every outsider called by God, Zipporah lives in the footnotes, in the faith, and in the fire of those still rising. She said almost nothing, and yet her silence shouts through the centuries. What does Zipporah's silence say about us, about the church today, about the way we remember and the way we forget? Because Zipporah didn't need a pulpit. She didn't need a robe. She didn't need a title. What she had was discernment. What she carried was covenant. What she performed was priestly. And yet how many churches would overlook her today? For every Zipporah remembered, how many more are hidden? Mothers, aunties, elders, wives, daughters, women who stood in the middle of the night, when no one was watching, when death was on the doorstep, when the man of God had fallen asleep to his own assignment. Maybe Zipporah was never just a wife. Maybe she was the shadow priest of the Exodus. Maybe she stood in a spiritual office the world couldn't recognize. Maybe she held the spiritual line when the chosen one of God almost let it break. And that makes us ask, how many Zipporahs walk among us now, invisible to man, but known by God? How many women carry the weight of the calling and still go unnamed? How many are saviors in silence? The church has exalted Moses for centuries, but maybe it's time we remember the woman who saved him, not because she needed recognition, but because her story holds power for the ones still hidden. Zipporah's legacy isn't a headline. It's a whisper, a scar, a prayer at 3 a.m., a decision that costs everything. Zipporah reminds us, God moves through the hidden. God honors the faithful. This is the final revelation. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob takes covenant seriously, even for leaders, even for the called, even for the anointed. And if Moses the deliverer could be stopped because of neglect, then how much more must we guard what God has entrusted to us? Zipporah's act wasn't just about Gershom. It was about the entire nation. Because covenant isn't private, it's prophetic. Her faithfulness in the tent opened the door for Israel's deliverance from Egypt. And maybe that's the message. Revival doesn't start on the stage. It starts in the home. Deliverance doesn't begin in Egypt. It begins with obedience in secret. So what's the final revelation? God almost killed Moses not because he hated him, but because he loves his covenant more than any man's calling. And he chose to spare Moses because a woman with no platform kept the covenant alive, with blood, with boldness, and with a holy defiance that said, "Not in my house." Zipporah reminds us the greatest moves of God are often saved by people whose names are whispered, not shouted. Zipporah, she doesn't have a book named after her. She never led an army. She never preached a sermon, but she saved a prophet. She protected a covenant, and she became the silent key to the Exodus. She may be forgotten in our modern Bibles, but God never forgot her. Her story reminds us the ones history forgets are often the ones heaven remembers most. So to every woman whose faith is quiet, to every intercessor behind the scenes, to every covenant keeper who stands in the gap, Zipporah's legacy is yours. If this story stirred something in your spirit, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to the Bible in white and black. Share this video with someone who needs to hear the buried truths of Scripture. Join us as we continue uncovering the stories of the powerful, overlooked women God used to shape the world. Because sometimes, the most dangerous kind of power is the one no one saw coming. God bless you.